Right now, the House of Representatives is still trying to pass a bill that a majority of Republicans and Democrats in the Senate have already said they won't vote for. It's a plan that would force us to relive this crisis in just a few short months, holding our economy captive to Washington politics once again. In other words, it does not solve the problem, and it has no chance of becoming law.
Well, I've got news for Washington. Those days are over. President Obama came to Congress in January and requested business as usual. He had another routine increase in the national debt, but we in the House said, not so fast. Here was the president asking for the largest debt increase in American history on the heels of the largest spending binge in American history. And here's what we got for that massive spending binge. A new health care bill that most Americans never asked for. A stimulus bill that's more effective in producing material for late-night comedians than it was in producing jobs. And a national debt that has gotten so out of hand, it sparked a crisis without precedent in my lifetime or yours. The United States cannot default on its debt obligations. The jobs and savings of too many Americans are at stake. What we told the president in January was this, that the American people will not accept an increase in the debt limit without significant spending cuts and reforms.
Just yesterday, Kevin McCarthy, the third-ranking Republican in the House, urged Republicans to unite behind Boehner's plan by showing this clip from the movie The Town.
I need your help. I can't tell you what it is. You can never ask me about it later, and we're going to hurt some people.
Our national debt is high, too high. And the problem is getting worse, not better. We are now $31 trillion in debt. That is more than the size of the entire American economy, 20% more. Our debt is now a greater burden than it has been at any time since World War II. If we continue down this path, in the next 10 years, we will spend over $8 trillion just on interest. That's more than the entire federal budget this year by a lot. That is neither affordable nor sustainable. When debt is too high, inflation is the result. That is where we are today.
We pay our bills, and we should do so without reckless hostage-taking from some of the mega Republicans in Congress.
A day of sheer panic on Wall Street. The global sell-off started in Asia, Tokyo down 2%, the selling increased, London down 3%, and finally, the massive tsunami of selling hit New York. The Dow down almost 6% at the closing bell. Even a midday presidential address meant to calm the markets couldn't staunch the bleeding.
No matter what some agency may say, we've always been and always will be a AAA country.
The worst day for the stock market since the height of the financial crisis, capping a run of 2 weeks, racing almost $2 trillion in stock market wealth. The average American 401k investor losing more than $16,000.
All right. Today is Tuesday, the 2nd of May. Welcome to another economic discussion. Folks, I got a good one for you tonight. We begin with the wall of worry. The economy, the Federal Reserve, and the federal government are now being squashed by two crises at the same time. Number one, bank failures, and number two, and this one appears to be flaring up right now, the debt crisis. We start with the banking crisis. By now, you might be aware that FRC, First Republic Bank, went kaput. It's gone. It has been sold to JP Morgan, and I would disagree with the terminology that we sold it to JP Morgan. I would actually say we gave it as a gift to JP Morgan. We paid JP Morgan, aka the laundromat, to assume First Republic Bank's assets, hundreds of billions of dollars. And to sweeten the deal, the FDIC extended tens of billions of dollars of loans to JP Morgan, and all what they had to pay is $10 billion. JP Morgan gave the FDIC $10 billion, and they got a few $100 billion in return. The sweetest deal in history. And have you noticed that every financial crisis we have, somehow JP Morgan ends up being the winner? I wonder why that is. In any case, as you can see, the collapse of First Republic Bank is the second largest bank failure in U.S. history. Bigger than Silicon Valley Bank, although be it smaller than Washington Mutual back in the great financial crisis in 2008. What baffles me is all of these, I'm trying to be nice here, but let's say delusional people, when they say that the economy is doing fine, we're going to have a soft landing, and this is the beginning of a new bull market. Have you noticed that we have more bank failures today in 2023 than we had back in the great financial crisis in 08-09? Yet somehow the economy's fine. Somehow this is the beginning of a new bull market. What kind of drugs are you on? Because I'd like to have some of that. And of course, as in any crisis that we have, your beloved politicians use the opportunity to get richer, to abuse the laws and their power, to gain access and insider information to make more and more money. They sold FRC before it collapsed. They bought JP Morgan shares before we saw the pop in the stock of JP Morgan on Monday. And they probably sold it right after the pop. Corruption as usual. Nothing new in Washington, D.C. But folks, you might have noticed that the stock market was down today. The market was upset. And the reason is we have the Federal Reserve with Chairman Powell coming out with a new decision about interest rate hikes. And the assumption is we're going to get another 25 basis points hike. The question becomes, is he going to pause or will he leave the door open for more interest rate hikes? We know that the inflation problem is still with us, and according to some indicators, there is a high degree of risk of inflation revving higher again if the Fed backs off. So what is the alternative? If the Fed leaves the door for yet another 25 basis points hike to come, and perhaps many more, we're going to see more and more bank failures. They're not going to be able to compete with yields in the open market, be it money market funds or even treasury yields. Banks right now are paying you what, 2% in your savings if you're lucky? Meanwhile, you can get 4.5%, 5% in the money market fund. And if the Fed continues to raise rates, why would I leave my deposit in these banks and getting nothing at all? We will see more and more exodus of these deposits. Or the alternative, banks will have to pay a decent interest rates on these savings, and that means doubling the rates they're paying right now. The problem is the majority of them, financially speaking, cannot really pay 4% plus in interest rates. They'll go bust. So either way, a lot of banks will go bust, either by the Fed raising rates to combat inflation and deposits fleeing away, or by actually raising the rates they're paying for depositors. So we will see more and more and more bank failures. The other choice for the Fed is to back off, to pause or cut rates and risk inflation rising higher again, and then they have to come back and address the problem from a less fortunate position. But that's crisis number one. The second crisis that is starting to loom large right now is the debt crisis. And yesterday we got a dire warning from the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, warning that the United States of America will default on its debt by June 1st. Take a look.
We begin our report with a new warning. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says the U.S. could run out of cash to pay its bills as soon as next month. In a letter sent to lawmakers Monday, Yellen said, quote, "We will be unable to continue to satisfy all of the government's obligations by early June and potentially as early as June 1st if Congress does not raise or suspend the debt limit before that time." Last week, House Republicans narrowly passed a bill to raise the nation's debt ceiling. The measure would lift the limit by $1.5 trillion, but imposes spending cuts to the federal budget. President Biden and Democrats believe the debt limit should be raised with no conditions, making House legislation with conditions for doing so dead on arrival in the Democratic-controlled Senate and White House. CBS News has learned that the president has now called all four congressional leaders, including House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy, and invited them for a meeting.
With that setup out of the way, let's pay a visit to Washington, D.C., and here it is, in focus tonight. Tick-tock. Will this be a benign negotiation, or are we going to have 2011 deja vu? You know, when CNN says it's time to worry about a U.S. default for real this time, we got to take it seriously, because CNN is in the business of selling fantasies. Not anymore. The reporter from CNN says, asked Justin Wolfers, a professor of economics and public policy at the University of Michigan, what separates the debt crisis from the banking crisis. He told me over the phone he's not at all worried about the money he has deposited in an American bank, arguing he has complete confidence in the FDIC to cover deposits, so long as they're not above $250,000, as it and banks have done for all three banks that failed this year. By the way, with that comes moral hazard, that hey banks, you can go ahead and take whatever risk you want to take. If things go sour, the Federal Reserve and the FDIC will come to the rescue. And that encourages more risk-taking and more bad behavior. But anyhow, he also pointed out that bank failures represent three relatively small institutions by U.S. standards, but he is extremely worried about the U.S. defaulting on its debt. He adds, this generation of bank regulators learned from their mistakes of the Great Depression and the 2008 financial crisis, suggesting they have no qualms about stepping in early to maintain confidence in the financial system. There is no similar confidence in the nation's politicians to do the same. There is a great fear that this generation of legislators are more irresponsible, more polarized, and more willing to do damage than any previous generation, he said. We will, at some point in the very near future, get to a place where Biden and McCarthy, along with other top Democrats and Republicans, must come together to avoid a default or deal with the aftermath of its occurrence. The question is whether the economy is damaged in the meantime. And listen to this. He also says, I will tell you that I am more worried than I've ever been in my career at this moment about the sky actually falling, Wolfers said, noting that in previous standoffs over the debt ceiling, Republicans have ultimately stood down in the face of pressure from more moderate wings of the party. It is not clear that that will happen this time. And of course, we know that the Republican, the Speaker of the House, McCarthy, barely got approved as Speaker of the House. He tried many times, and he had to offer a lot of compromise before, let's say, the most extreme wing of the Republican Party approved of his speakership. But McCarthy had to compromise, and this is really, really important. This is the main difference between now and 2011. Part of the deal of McCarthy becoming Speaker, it takes one member of the Republican Party to take McCarthy out. In other words, Kevin McCarthy gave a lot of leverage to these politicians, and now he has to dance on their tune. If he fails, if he compromises, he'll be gone. The stakes could not be any higher. What we know for now is the Republicans passed a debt limit spending cut package in the House. The problem is the Democrat-held Senate will not pass the bill. But we have to take it one step at a time and look at the details of this package, because the negotiation will be based on this package right here. And by the way, the details of this package have enormous ramifications in the stock market. Part number one of the package is claw back unspent the Thing 19 funds. The plan would cancel the remaining funds from the $5.2 trillion Congress approved between 2020 and 22 to fight the Thing. According to the White House, the remaining money amounted to less than $80 billion, and it is likely lower now. Most of that money is earmarked for troubled union pension funds, veterans' health care, and medical research. So that's not going to cut it. What else? How about cancel student debt relief? It would cancel Democratic President Joe Biden's effort to cancel roughly $400 billion in student debt, which Republicans have portrayed as unfair to those who did not go to college or already paid off their debts. The Supreme Court is expected to rule before July whether that plan is legal. This is a problem because, number one, what if the Supreme Court says, hey, Joe Biden, you can't really cancel all of this student debt? Then the Republicans will have to come up with something else. More cuts. Number two, if the student relief package is canceled because Joe Biden compromises and says, okay, we're not going to cancel the student debt anymore, then a huge swath of the American consumer will have to be burdened again with payments. Monthly payments to pay their student debt, money that would otherwise might have gone to stimulate the economy, which means more and more stagnation in the economy as the consumer pulls away from spending to pay for inflation and for debt. Number three in the Republican package, the IRS budget. The plan targets an $80 billion investment plan for the Internal Revenue Service, which the tax collecting agency will use to hire more employees and deploy new technology to harass American citizens, of course. This would actually worsen the government's budget woes, as it would sacrifice the increased revenue that the IRS would generate through better tax enforcement, a figure that the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office puts at $204 billion. Now, do we have bad actors who avoid paying taxes and they use loopholes? Sure, but a lot of these loopholes are legal. And America's oligarchs, the billionaires, they're not going to pay a dime. They live on loans. They borrow against their inflated stock market values, and they live on that. They don't pay taxes at all. They only pay if they sell, and they're not going to sell. But we cannot really enforce a wealth tax. That's not realistic at all. So the IRS will use this budget, guns blazing, crashing doors, choppers, armored vehicles, dogs, to grab Americans and say, hey, you did not pay so-and-so. We'll take you to jail. We'll make an example out of you. Do you really think all of these agents will just sit in an office and do nothing? Maybe they'll do TikTok videos? Of course not. They're coming after you. Here's the other part of the Republican package: repeal green tax incentives. This will have enormous ramifications in the stock market because so far we've seen electric vehicle stocks and solar stocks outperforming. But if the Republicans take that out, a lot of these stocks will come down crashing. It would repeal incentives for renewable energy, electric vehicles, and other climate-friendly technology that Democrats passed last year as a part of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which we've been waiting for it to kick in. It does not target corporate tax increases, drug pricing restraints, or other aspects of that law. And listen to this: the April 26 bill passed by the Republican-led House would slash tax incentives for solar energy and implement $4.5 trillion in spending cuts, or about 22% in exchange for a $1.5 trillion increase in the U.S. debt limit. So this would be horrific for any green energy stocks, any green energy companies. Then, of course, part of the Republican plan: tighten work requirements. What does that mean? The plan would stiffen work requirements for participants in some anti-poverty programs. Childless adults up to 56 who get health insurance through Medicaid, which covers low-income people, would have to work at least 80 hours a month or participate in a job training or community service. Likewise, childless adults up to 56 years old who receive food assistance through the SNAP program would lose benefits after 3 months if they could not prove they were working at least 20 hours a week or participating in a job training program. Those work requirements currently apply to those up to 50 years old. In other words, if you happen to be 56 and you're single and poor, you might want to become a baby daddy. And then, of course, the last parts of the Republican package: increased authority over regulations and more incentives for oil and gas. So this will be good for oil and gas stocks. But not part of the Republican package: defense spending. You know why? Because they're owned and beholden to the military-industrial complex and defense contractors. You want to cut spending? Look no other than the money laundering machine we call the Pentagon. The headline from Axios says the U.S. spent more in military in 22 than the next 10 countries combined. We spend way more than China, 10 times more than Russia, more than 10 times what India spends. But somehow, every time I see these generals on TV talking about war, all they do is ask for more money. Oh, we need more funding. Our military is depleted. China is about to take over. Well, China spends a fraction of what we spend. Either, number one, they're more efficient than us, or number two, we're abusing the money. The question is, where are the trillions and trillions of dollars we gave the Pentagon in the last few years? How come our military is depleted right now after trillions and trillions of dollars? How come the Republicans don't even dare cut defense spending? And by the way, the Democrats alike, nobody will even dare to touch the holy spending on defense. Otherwise, you might be called a Russian or a Chinese traitor. In any case, look at our debt right now, skyrocketing. I wish I could have invested in this chart. Forget about Nvidia or Apple. This chart is literally in the moon. It's about to go higher again at some point, and this point is becoming really close. We have to put an end of racking more and more debt. And the only way, realistically speaking, we can achieve this objective is, number one, austerity measures. Cut spending dramatically. Number two, raise taxes dramatically. We are already overtaxed, But the only way out of this debt is more and more taxation, which means that the prospects of the U.S. economy with more spending cuts and more taxes is extremely dire. And here is the warning by Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, aka Transitory Yellen. She says the U.S. default on debt would trigger an economic catastrophe. The estimate raised the risk that the United States is headed for unprecedented default that would shake the global economy, adding new urgency to political calculations in Washington, where Democrats and Republicans were grinding for a months-long standoff. Biden called Republican House Speaker Kevin McCarthy in Jerusalem. What the hell is Kevin McCarthy doing in Jerusalem? Shouldn't he be here? Anyways, or he is on a diplomatic trip to invite him to a May 9 White House meeting. The two leaders have not sat down to discuss the issue since February because, of course, they've been on vacation. Spring recess. They always take time off. And we already talked about this. House Republicans passed a bill to raise the debt limit last week that include steep cuts to spending from health care to the poor to air traffic controllers, which the Democratic-controlled Senate and Biden say they will not approve. Biden has steadfastly said he will not negotiate over the debt ceiling increase, but will discuss budget cuts after a new limit is passed. So Biden says no negotiations right now. Give me what I want, and then we'll talk. Republicans say, let's negotiate first, and then you get what you want. Congress has often paired debt ceiling increases with other budget and spending measures. But we know for now that the bill has no chance of passing the Democrat-controlled Senate, and the White House has said Biden would veto the legislation if it did. And the risk here, somebody like Joe Manchin, for example, goes with this, and it accidentally passes. Biden says he's going to veto anyways. And Schumer, the Democrat, told reporters that the House bill is dead on arrival, quote-unquote, and that the Republican measure only brings us dangerously closer to an historic U.S. debt default that would shake markets and economies worldwide. And I bet the politicians will short the market ahead of time. From the Democrats' point of view, Republicans' massive tax cuts to the rich have cost taxpayers over $10 trillion over the last 2 decades, and now they want America's workers and families to pay the price. The Republican view, of course, is Biden has been spending like a drunken sailor with no caps at all, and now we got inflation. Now, we know that we hit the debt ceiling back in January, but we've been sliding under emergency measures, or what Janet Yellen calls extraordinary measures. But now, we're even running out of cash from these extraordinary measures. After hitting the $31.4 trillion borrowing cap on January 19th, Yellen previously told Congress that Treasury would keep up payments on debt, federal benefits, and make other spending by using extraordinary cash management measures. One such step Treasury is taking is suspending the sales of securities that state and local governments use to temporarily hold cash. The problem is, we ran out of that cash. So Janet Yellen was hoping that the taxes we all paid somehow will buy them more time. And we got the headline that the U.S. Treasury's cash pile jumps to $108 billion on tax day. Thank you to the taxpayer. The tax receipts received on Tuesday, that is tax day, boosted a cash pile that has been whittled down in a bid to avoid crashing into the nation's statutory debt limit. The Treasury Department's cash balance rose to $252.55 billion on Tuesday from $144.08 billion the day before, as payments related to the Internal Revenue Service's main annual filing deadline rolled in. The Treasury's bank account has been under downward pressure recently because of measures been taking to avoid breaching the $31.4 trillion debt cap. And last week, that is at the time of course, dwindled to as little as $86.55 billion. Now, this $86.55 billion, it's gone. And whatever $252 billion that we paid in taxes, half of that came from my pocket, by the way, that's gone too. The spending is on steroids. We can go over $100 billion in a matter of days. No wonder why we're at the brink of default right now. And let's be honest, folks. What is the probability of these politicians letting the country default? The answer is, it is really slim. Things could get out of hand and the country defaults, and that would be a catastrophe. But in the meantime, it's going to be a painful period of negotiations. And it's going to rattle the stock market, and it will rattle the economy. When we look at the game played right now, we got Joe Biden and we got Kevin McCarthy. They have two choices. Wave the white flag and say, okay, I'll do whatever you want. Biden would say in this case, hey, Kevin McCarthy, I'm going to accept the bill you guys passed in the House. In McCarthy's case, he would say, you know what, Joe Biden, for all time's sakes, we're just going to raise the debt ceiling and then talk about all of these budget negotiations. We know that's not going to happen, but anyways. The other choice is stick to your guns. In case of Joe Biden, he would say, no, we're not negotiating. In the case of McCarthy, he would say, well, I'm not negotiating either. Either you pass whatever I passed in the House, or let's default. And the starting point would be both men sticking to their guns. And then, scenario number one, Biden falls under pressure. He waves the white flag and says, okay, we're going to cut a lot of spending. Maybe we're not going to go exactly with the bill that you guys passed, but parts of it. The ramifications for the economy is less spending, meaning inflation will go down, but that will be at the expense of stagnation, which could push the economy into a recession. I mean, it is heading into a recession either way. Scenario number two is Biden sticks to his guns, McCarthy falls. In this case, what happens? The spending on steroids goes on, creating more inflation, and of course, there are political ramifications for Kevin McCarthy. We'll talk about that in a second. But the other solution, perhaps what's best for America, is for both men to compromise. Biden looks at what McCarthy passed, says, okay, that's bullshit, but we'll go with this one. McCarthy compromises by cutting less spending than what he thought, and we live for another day. And this is, of course, the most plausible scenario. Now, if both men stick to their guns all the way till the deadline, then there is a possibility of defaulting, and that would be, once again, a catastrophe. So let's see who's going to fold first. What are the stakes for both men? If McCarthy holds to his guns, the same goes with Biden, or if one of these men wave the white flag first. If McCarthy sticks to his guns, the risk is game over. The country defaults because Joe Biden says, I'm going to do the same. And the game of chicken ends up defaulting the country. Will the Republicans pay a price because of that? Or will they say, hey, this is the Biden default? Hashtag Biden default. I think at the end of the day, if the country defaults, you blame the top guy. The president eats the majority of the blame. So the Republicans maybe can withstand this scenario and absorb it better than the Democrats, in this case Biden. On the other hand, if McCarthy falls right away, he's dead. His party, it takes one member to take him out. And they would argue, hey, you had the power, you had the leverage. Why didn't you negotiate? Why didn't you turn up the heat? Why did you fold and capitulate right away? You're dead to me. Now, when it comes to President Joey B., he displays a lot of weakness. He's holding Schumer's arm because, God forbid, he's going to fall down. So he's an easy mark. And I believe that McCarthy will exploit this weakness dramatically. But what happens if President Biden sticks to his guns? There is a risk. The risk would be for a default. And in this case, once again, he will eat the majority of the blame. He can say, oh, the Republicans, the MAGA Republicans are too extreme and they defaulted the country. But for the average Joe and Jane, they blame the top guy. On the other hand, what is the consequence if Joe Biden capitulates and says, okay, McCarthy, I'll do whatever you ask. Let's just avoid a default. Back to Reuters. They say that the game of chicken comes as the White House prepares for Biden's expected re-election campaign, which we now know it's already on. Biden, 80 years old, is expected to announce in February that he plans to run for a second term. He did not announce in February, he announced last week, so it took him a little while. But he and his aides plan to focus on the rock-solid labor market. Let's see how long that's going to last. Falling costs and threats from extreme Republicans. That is the most important part. The labor market would be bad by the time of the re-election. Costs, we know that inflation is not going down. So his only hope is running on the threat of extreme Republicans. The debt ceiling fight could help Biden here. Some strategists say. Biden and top U.S. officials have repeatedly said that they believe the economy's growth can slow to more sustainable levels without putting people out of work. The so-called, quote, soft landing, end quote, is what the Federal Reserve is aiming for as well, though they have conceded the goal may be elusive. Now, with all of these bank failures, forget about the soft landing. So again, the economy is going to be in a shithole anyways. What is the consequence for Joe Biden if he capitulates? Is he really going to lose support from the Democratic voter? Of course not. Even if the economy is in a recession, he might lose some voters, but his main pitch is, oh, but Trump. The economy might be in a recession right now, but you're scared of Trump. You don't want that guy to be back as president. You'll vote for me anyways, even if I cave to Kevin McCarthy, which makes the scenario of Joe Biden folding first more likely. In other words, McCarthy has the advantage in this negotiation. But folks, Until this negotiation is done, there could be a lot of damage between now and then. In 2011, a similar debt ceiling fight took the country to the brink of default and prompted a downgrade of the country's top-notch credit rating. This time, negotiations may be even more difficult, veterans of 2011's face-off say. And the bottom line, folks, perhaps to reach a deal between McCarthy and Biden, it will take a crash in the stock market just like we got back in 2011. In other words, buckle up. The Fed comes tomorrow, Apple is going to report after that, but the debt ceiling fight will loom large, and it will take the stock market to crash before a deal is done. Buckle up. You haven't seen anything yet. With that, folks, we have reached the conclusion of this video, and we will have more videos coming out for you tomorrow, including yet another In Focus segment, along with earnings reports from week number 1 and week number 2 that we got so far this season. We've also produced another video earlier today for the members of this channel, going over the market analysis, the technical developments. We talked about the Bank of Australia and the recent macroeconomics data that we got today. Check it out if you happen to be a member. If not, consider joining. But folks, this is all I got for you for now. Thank you for listening, thank you for watching, and I will talk to you again tomorrow. Good night.
I need your help. I can't tell you what it is. You can never ask me about it later, and we're gonna hurt some people.
Picturing the forest decomposing, full of rotten trees whose roots they run too deep. And then there's me, poison in the first.